as part of the committee, the joint committees that undertook the responsibility of Article 118 of the Constitution to do what the Constitution requires of us, that is a public participation, and especially on a bill that is presented before the House. Mr. Speaker, when this bill was committed to our committee, the Joint Committee of Housing, Urban Planning and Public Works, and also the Departmental Committee on Finance and National Planning, we started the responsibility of listening to the people of this republic. Mr. Speaker, we went to several counties, and amongst the counties that we visited, Mr. Speaker, was Nairobi County, which has the biggest problem on matters housing, Mr. Speaker. We also visited other counties, Mr. Speaker, which ordinarily people would imagine that they don't need housing, Mr. Speaker, like Turkana, Wajir, and Narok and Kajiado, Mr. Speaker. But in all our visits, Mr. Speaker, people want houses. Mr. Speaker, under Article 43B of our Constitution, Mr. Speaker, obliges the government to ensure that it creates a situation where its citizens access affordable housing, among other recommendations that goes with the affordable housing. Mr. Speaker, it is our responsibility also as a House, as Parliament, to ensure that we actualize Article 43 of our Constitution. And in that process, Mr. Speaker, we undertook to listen after looking at the bill and listen to the people of this republic. Mr. Speaker, in our findings, when we went around the country, Mr. Speaker, among the many issues which people raised was that they really want these houses. But how will they access these houses, Mr. Speaker? Equally so that not other people are prejudiced or not other people are disadvantaged. Mr. Speaker, the other question which people raised also, Mr. Speaker, is how do we build these houses? There was the question of voluntary contribution, Mr. Speaker, among the people we met. There were the questions of compulsory or voluntary and of course, a contribution that is forced. Mr. Speaker, we also listened to people who talked about how do we levy everybody, Mr. Speaker. Remember when the courts ruled? The courts ruled on the fact that there was no legal framework in place that will ensure the collection of levies was made equal so that it is not discriminatory, it touches on everybody. And these are the questions we also took. These are the questions which most of the members of the public came to ask. How is the levy going to be undertaken? Mr. Speaker, most touching was areas that we visited, especially the slums of this country, Mr. Speaker. And in the slum areas, Mr. Speaker, people live in deplorable conditions, which every Kenyan who think this particular bill of housing is not necessary, you will need to visit those particular areas. I visited those areas myself, for the first time in some other areas, for the second time in some other areas, and we realized that people need houses. The only problem is accessing these particular houses. We even visit the Maasai areas where people wanted houses that are actually the model of Manyatas. We visited Turkana, Mr. Speaker, where people wanted houses, the model of how Turkana live in those houses. We visited areas like Tana River, Mr. Speaker, where we had floods. And people think these houses come in handy to ensure that the people who are affected by floods, they called it cluster, Mr. Speaker, are also accorded the opportunity of having these particular houses. So, Mr. Speaker, I do not want to belabor much on these particular issues, but my submissions, Mr. Speaker, is number one, how do we make these houses accessible? How do we, or how does the government build these houses? Mr. Speaker, on the question of levies, people introduced many other aspects to the collection of levies. Some wanted levies to be collected and, of course, at the end of it should accrue benefits. Some made proposals to the extent that it should behave like the NSSF model, where at the end of your retirement, you can still access that amount of money. There are so many proposals which people made, Mr. Speaker. And it is upon this House, Mr. Speaker, to make recommendations. And in the end, to do amendments on areas where they think fits to be done. Mr. Speaker, in this particular bill, Mr. Speaker, proposes the formation of a board. And in that aspect, Mr. Speaker, many people also were asking, after collection of this money, Mr. Speaker, how is it going to be managed? How is it going to be implemented? How is it going to be fair? Mr. Speaker, there is a proposal for the formation of a board that will have also to be compliant with the Constitution. And among the many proposals, Mr. Speaker, from the members of the public, including also the professionals, they want a board that will actually manage the funds having been collected by KRA. And that board should manage the funds, allocate the funds to several categories of houses which are going to be built. And Mr. Speaker, when I say the categories of houses, we have the category of affordable housing, which is the normal housing that we know that are low cost. Another category, Mr. Speaker, are institutional housing. And remember, Mr. Speaker, the police officers, the KDF, the prison warders, and all those people who live in our institutions, who work on our institutions, live on houses that are very deplorable. Amongst the allocation of these funds, Mr. Speaker, will go towards those particular housing, Mr. Speaker. On institutional housing, Mr. Speaker, also, you remember that most of our universities do not have enough money to build hostels. And many people propose that we should allocate part of this money to build the hostels so that it can become accessible to our students wherever they are and at a cheaper rate, Mr. Speaker. Among other housing also, Mr. Speaker, which are people who are proposing for allocation of this money are social housing. These are houses like the upgrade of slums, people to move from slums to at least good houses through the social housing program. And among us also areas where people thought maybe this money should be allocated are the county governments. The issue of county governments rose in every other public meeting we had, so that it became apparent that among us, the institutions to be allocated these funds are also county governments. Mr. Speaker, the board also will be given the responsibility, because there was another issue where people are asking, after allocating this money to other institutions like the NHC, the State Department, the county governments, and all those other agencies, how will the board get back the money? Because this money has to be like a revolving fund. After selling those houses, where does that money go? Will it remain with the NHC? Will it remain with other agencies? Mr. Speaker, the recommendations which people want is that after these houses have been built and offtake undertaken, the money should revert back to the board, to the fund, so that it can also be used to build other houses. Mr. Speaker, there was also the question of deposit, which is in this bill. Most of the citizens of this country, Mr. Speaker, feel that there are so many people who may not access enough money to pay a deposit of 10%. And Mr. Speaker, we also muled around it. And the committee felt that the question of deposit should be considered on a case-by-case situation. Mr. Speaker, people also thought, for example, the houses which are built in Nairobi or houses built in several areas. Mr. Speaker, people feel that how do we protect or how do we ring fence these houses so that it is not bought by only those who have money? Mr. Speaker, so that it can also be accessed by everybody. And Mr. Speaker, we felt that there should be regulations should be put in place that will also ring fence those particular houses to the people of those particular areas. Mr. Speaker, among the proposals also which are in this bill and people found it acceptable are the provision of loans by the board that even after all this money has been collected, those people who want to buy these houses, Mr. Speaker, and they do not have money, they can take a loan from the board so that they can buy these houses and repay the board slowly throughout the years. Mr. Speaker, lastly, there was also the issue of land, which arose in most of the cases, that the land that these monies is going to be utilized on, most of them are public land, most of them are county land, and how then will the public benefit from those particular houses, Mr. Speaker? And we mulled around it, and of course, we have a section in the Land Act that deals with the conversion of land, if you want, or especially the disposition of land from public land to private land, Mr. Speaker, and we all agreed that we will leave that issue of land to the National Land Commission to deal with it. Mr. Speaker, in general, I'm among as members who sat with the members of the public. I listened to them just like the other members of my committee. And Mr. Speaker, our country, our population, 80% of the population of this country are living in shanties, temporary homes, slums. Others are living on areas where you can't imagine, Mr. Speaker. It is prudent. It is high time. And so many governments, Mr. Speaker, have run away from this responsibility. No government has dared to take the bold step which the president has taken. I also want us as this House to take that bold step to ensure, and we have had so many expenditures in this country, Mr. Speaker. I particularly have been in this House for the last 10 years. I've seen budgets go, I've seen budgets being brought to this House. Mr. Speaker, if you go to the villages, there has been so many budgets done in this House, and you don't even see them, or anything that has been undertaken in the budgets which have been allocated here. Mr. Speaker, I personally felt that let us take this bold step, pass this bill, and wait for the results. And most of us who are sitting in the oversight committees, we will ensure that the projects which have been earmarked under this particular bill, Mr. Speaker, will be put into prudent use. There are so many of us who would say, what is the use? So many of us would also say, how assured are we that we are going to build houses? I've always also said, Mr. Speaker, the appropriation of any money is done in this House. The oversight of any money allocated to the executive is done by this House. It is our responsibility, Mr. Speaker. We cannot run away from our responsibility. Just because we are lazy, we cannot oversight those monies which have been allocated. So, Mr. Speaker, I this House. Our people need houses. Everywhere. We went to Nyanza, we went to Western, we went to Northeastern, we went to Coast, we went to Rift Valley. Everywhere, Mr. Speaker, people need houses. It is our responsibility as a House to ensure that we actualize Article 43B of that part of the Constitution. The question of how that money is going to be spent rests in this House. It rests especially on all of us, regardless of which political divide you come from. Because every money that has been appropriated here depend on us to ensure that it is utilized properly. With those few remarks, Mr. Speaker, I wish to second. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Ngeno. I now propose the question, which is that the Affordable Housing Bill, National Assembly Bill number 75 of 2023, be now read a second time. Yes, Minority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for having given me the first bite of the cherry. Mr. Speaker, let me start by saying that, of course, this bill is obviously a response or a reaction to the now very famous High Court ruling of November 2023. So we must thank our courts for having jolted the executive to do what they should have done at the first instance. But we must also take cognizance of the fact that even as we debate this bill, the matter is still live in court. It is still lying in the Court of Appeal, pending determination. That notwithstanding, let me make the following comments. That if you look at the bill, the introduction to the bill itself, it states categorically that this is an act, that's a bill for an act of parliament to give effect to Article 43(1)(b) of the Constitution, to provide a framework for access